Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to have you today in the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's, well, the book is The Human Condition, also called the Vita Activa, which was her original title and the title in the German edition. You know, it's often considered to be her most political theoretical work, and in the world of political theory, it is certainly the work that has the most attention. You know, one of the features of the book is this incredible attempts she makes to set boundaries. The boundaries between the human and the animal, the boundaries between the public and the private, later between the vita or between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa, between labor, work, and action. And you know, these categories, you know, at least in my view, are at times incredibly illuminating and at times incredibly frustrating. And so, you know, I've said a number of times, and I'll have to keep reminding myself and you that she doesn't mean these categories in the sense of absolute distinctions. And I think there's always a tendency reading her, and it's certainly a tendency in the academic literature reading her, to sort of think that she says there's this absolute public and absolute private, or absolute labor versus action, or labor versus work, and we need to resist that. It's an important, I think, mistake in reading her. We're in the middle of, and well, today we'll finish this chapter, which is the second chapter of the book, called The Public and Private Realm. She's here attempting to make a distinction between the public and private realm, a distinction that, again, never was absolute, right? I mean, if you read these sections, you'll see how the Greeks saw some of it here, but the Romans saw some of it there. There was never an absolute distinction between the public and private realm. But part of the argument of this chapter is that the distinction that even though these two realms were never fully distinct and never are absolute, they both have had an important role to play in our understanding of the human condition. Now, again, I'm going to do a little bit very careful here. The human condition, not human nature, right? It's not that either the public realm or the private realm are important for human nature. They're important for the human condition, which is the way that the world, the human common world, has emerged as something that is conditioned by ourselves as we encounter it and then make it and remake it and remake it. The argument in general of this second chapter on the private, public, and private realm is that both the public and private realms became deeply important for the human condition as it emerged, and that the public realm answered a deep need of humanity as it emerged through the human condition, to show itself in innumerable perspectives. It speaks to plurality. The public realm is that place where we humans can see and hear from different positions, and only when we can speak and act such that our speech and our act are heard from a multitude of people, do we begin to see the fullness of the world, the worldly reality. And so the common world includes, she says, this worldly reality includes plural locations and plural persons. And thus, as she says on page 57 at the end of the last section that we read last week, she says, only where things can be seen by many in a variety of aspects without changing their identity, so that those who are gathered around them know they see sameness in utter diversity, can worldly reality truly and reliably appear. So this is her idea of the public, that only when we see things in a wide variety of perspectives, and we gather around and we see people who are both different and the same, different in that we're all unique, the same in that we're part of this worldly reality, that we share a world. Only when that happens, can we live in this public realm and in the fullness of our uniqueness and our plurality, which is part of what she understands the human condition to be. In the first two sections we're reading today on privacy. So the first one called the private realm on property, and the second one, the private realm and the social, and the private. She is addressing what she takes to be a fact, right? Which is that we are losing both the public realm and the private realm. And part of that is what she calls the rise of the social. So she begins section 8 on the private realm and property with the sentence that it is with respect to this multiple significance of the public realm, namely that the public realm is where we enter a world of plurality and become human. It is with respect to this multiple significance of the public realm that the term private in its original privative sense has meaning. And so, I mean, we've talked about this, I think, already before, but we have to remember it. Privation, privacy. It's the absence of the political or the public. It's where we go and it's where we disappear and are hidden. And so there's a way, and so much of of how people interpret her on privacy is in this privative sense as a privation. But this chapter is actually largely doing something else, which is suggesting that there's also parts of the private realm that are meaningful and important. And so the main one of that is going to be property. Now, Arendt's connection to capitalism and to Marxism is always complicated, and it's not simple. But one thing that I think she's fairly consistent on is that she sees what she calls in another text, in an interview she gave in the 1960s, the unity of capitalism and socialism. And she says that the unity of capitalism and socialism is expropriation. Capitalism began with expropriation, the taking away of land from the peasants. And it is a kind of expropriation where where poor people are expropriated of land and money. Socialism, she says, radicalizes capitalism. It's not against capitalism. It's simply a radicalization of capitalism. Insofar as for socialism, we expropriate property from everyone, not just the poor. It's the total expropriation, she says, is what socialism is. And it occurs, she writes in this interview, or she says in this interview, when all political and legal safeguards of private ownership have disappeared. And so private property is part of privacy. Part of a privation. It's a separation from the public world. And yet private property, she's going to argue, has a political importance. So this is on page 61. The political importance of private property is that property, even though it lies in the private realm, was always thought to be of utmost importance to the political body. Why? Well, in its most basic sense, because it's a place. Okay, there's going to be two main arguments she makes in the next chapter about it, but it's private property on the one hand is a kind of surge or activization. The desire to own and accumulate private property for her leads us to act. And in leading us to act, leads us to live. And so private property is part of almost a necessary will to live. She's going to argue in chapter 9. And the second positive aspect of private property is that it provides us a sanctuary, a hiding place from the common, a dark ground, a place where we can be protected from both the state and society. And so she wants to make this argument that privacy is not only negative, privative, but is actually important, is even sacred. And to do so, though, she says she has to distinguish between privacy and wealth. And this is an important distinction. I don't think it's one that's been as understood as widely as it should in her work. What is the difference between wealth and property? Very simply, property is tangible. The sort of quintessential example of property for her is a house. It's something you own, but it's something that places you in the world. It gives you a spot in the world, a home. And in this sense, property is sacred. It's to have a location in the world. It's to belong somewhere. It gives you a sense of meaning and location in the world. The sacredness of property is like the sacredness of the hidden, of birth and death. And here she makes an argument that again is going to be controversial, and we should talk about it. That privacy and private property is often concerns a place where the bodily is settled. And the bodily for her includes labor. It included women. It included children. And it included slaves. It included all of the places where things like birth and death and work and the things that are part of necessity are hidden in a private realm. So she says that was part of what property was. It's different from wealth. What is wealth? Well, wealth is fungible, or wealth is consumable. Wealth has its highest characteristic in money. And part of the argument here is that privacy and the relation between private property and privacy depended upon property, where you had a place and a house where your family lived, where you could hide things and be protected from the world. That once property becomes wealth, is monetized, it loses its ability to hide us, to give us a place to hide and live. And And so this move from like the sacredness of private property to wealth is for her the beginning of the loss of privacy. It's a loss of boundaries, a loss of a law. I mean, once, think of it today. I mean, most of us will, if we're lucky, if some of us will rent houses. But if you own a house, you'll probably not own one house, you'll own a bunch. And you buy one, you maybe fix it up, you sell it, you buy another, you sell it. And if you die, your kids take it and usually sell it off, right? Whereas the old idea of a house, which was a family spot, was for her, again, an indication of the importance of a private place, of something that was a wall that would protect you and give you a place in the world behind which you would belong. And this is something that when property becomes an investment, when property and houses become something we simply buy and sell, they turn into wealth. They become consumable. And this is another way in which we have more expropriation. It's not just the peasants, but everyone now doesn't own property, but has been reduced to owning simply wealth. And wealth does not, she says, respect property or privacy. It doesn't give you a place to retreat behind where you can be free inside your home. And so property, which she says on footnote 72 on page 67, whereas property, even Proudhon understood, who thought property was theft, that property was the most efficient means to resist despotism without overthrowing the state. Wealth doesn't in any way resist despotism. And so this is a big difference for her between property and wealth. So chapter 8 is about private property and how we've moved from this sacred idea of private property to wealth, which doesn't either protect the family or any kind of sacredness, but further than that, doesn't protect civil liberties or civil rights or liberty in any way. Chapter 9 is about the social and the private. And again, remember the social is this intermediate realm that emerges, that is neither public nor private. It is the realm of society, the realm of opinion, where we have one opinion and where we seek one human interest. And the primary human interest that she's interested in here in chapter 9, the first rise of the social, she says, was the rise of the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie wanted to protect private property so that they could accumulate more. And this social need or social desire to protect property so you can accumulate more is the socialization of wealth. Private property, again, becomes less something sacred and more something to be accumulated so that one can buy more and consume more. And so whereas property has a kind of worldliness, the house that stays and lasts through generations, wealth is constantly consumed, and we lose this, she says, durability and permanence of the world. The exception to that is when wealth becomes capital that can be reinvested, and in being reinvested, it creates more capital and creates a kind of permanent structure. But she calls this a process rather than the permanence of a stable structure, because the capitalization of wealth leads to more wealth and more wealth, but it doesn't lead to a house lasting or a pen lasting or a desk lasting or whatever it is that might last. And so the pursuit of a common wealth through a public economy is not the same, she says on page 69, as the preservation of a common world. Her basic point here is that property increasingly disappears, turns into turns into wealth, then into capital, and I become increasingly someone who owns nothing and is nowhere except that I own myself, my labor power, and this is what a free laborer is, assuming I'm a free laborer and not a woman or a slave or a child, who don't even have that. As I said before, the danger she sees to human existence from this socialization of property, which she attributes both to capitalism and to Marxism, is that we lose the private, and the loss of the private is, as I said earlier, on the one hand, the loss of this drive to act, this need to acquire, which actually protects us from apathy and from almost dying in a kind of uninterested, non-consuming, non-productive laziness. And the second danger is that we lose a hiding place from the common. So this is on page 71. And this is actually, I think, one of the more, this is an idea that Arendt will raise in many of her books and essays. And it's one that I think is deeply important today, that the private, a lot of people talk about privacy today and the need for privacy, right? It's one of our common themes. And yet very few, and in fact, I would argue almost nobody in the history of thought that I know of has articulated a defense of privacy, why privacy matters. They all talk about, well, we're losing privacy, but they never articulate why it matters. Hannah Arendt, in her works, is one of the few people who repeatedly articulate an argument for the importance of a private life and a private world to humanity. And here on page 71, she says she says a number of arguments that will get developed in other books. She says in the middle of the page, the second outstanding non-privative characteristic of privacy. So the other positive aspect of privacy, the not privative one, is that the four walls of one's private property offer the only reliable hiding place from the common public world, not only from everything that goes on in it, but also from its very publicity, from being seen and heard. So that we need a place to be hidden from the common public world. No one, she thinks, can live all their lives in public. And then she says, a life spent entirely in public, in the presence of others, becomes, as we would say, shallow. While it retains its visibility, it loses the quality of rising into sight from some darker ground which must remain hidden, if it is not to lose its depth in a very real, non-subjective sense. So this is something she's going to develop in a number of essays. Her essay on education, crisis in education, and in other places as well, also in parts of on revolution. The argument is I understand it, is that in order to live a public life, to be visible and seen and heard by others, to live a plural life, we all need a time out of the public, but B, we need to emerge into the public from out of the shadows. Why is that? Why, it's a fascinating argument. I think it's because we need to emerge into the public as persons, as human beings. And that's a process that she thinks can't be seen. We have to, if it's seen, then, we're not shocking, we're not new, we're not unique. Part of the beauty of the public is it's where unique, plural people meet and come together. And she thinks that the private is important because we have a quality of rising into sight from out of some hidden darkness. And she says the only efficient way to guarantee the darkness of what needs to be hidden against the light of publicity is private property, a privately owned place to hide in. I mean, this is part of also, again, her very, I think, unpopular today defense of the fact that certain things should be hidden. The body. People shouldn't see how we eat. They shouldn't see how we go to the bathroom, or, how we puddle around in our homes. Right now, we're all seeing this with Zoom today. We need to come into the world. We need a place where we can be hidden and unique and make mistakes and be ugly and even offensive. This is her argument about the importance of privacy. And it's one that, again, it's just not many people actually do the effort of making an argument for privacy. They just assume it should exist. And then when it's disappearing, they say, oh, well, it's not so bad that it's disappearing. But she actually makes an argument for it, and it's going to be a controversial argument. But it's there. The final chapter of that we read for today, and the final section of this chapter, I'm sorry, is called The Location of the Human Activities. It's actually the proper location of the human activities in German. And the argument here is that there is a proper location for different human activities. That the public is where is for those activities that need to be seen, speech and action, and the private is for those things that need to be hidden, the bodily, the work, the labor, the ugly, the birth, the death, those things that should be hidden and kept personal for us, so that we can then put an image or a person fully out into the world. This chapter is again represents an idea or embodies an idea that Arendt speaks about in many of her books. And again, it's one that's unpopular. I mean, look, it's sort of amazing to me to think of Arendt as a popular thinker today, and the fact that 141 of us are on here, because so much of what she says is unpopular. But here, the argument of this chapter is that you should not be good in public. That goodness is dangerous as a public or political idea. In the 1960s, she was teaching at the University of Chicago, and one of her students, someone I don't know anything about, named William O'Grady, wrote to her and said, "I'm trying to be good, and I don't know how to do it." And she responded in a letter, quote, "I don't quite know what you mean when you say good, but I know that the wish to be good is an even greater temptation than the wish to be wise. That is precisely what we cannot be." So both wisdom and goodness for Arendt are things we cannot be. And goodness even more so than wisdom, as she'll say on page 75. Goodness is the most extreme thing that we cannot be, and that we must not seek to be in public. We must hide our goodness. As she says in her essay on Bertolt Brecht, terrible is the temptation to goodness. This is a line that Hegel uses as well in his philosophy of law, that the greatest evil always conceals itself as the greatest good. If anyone knows where that, I remember that line. I've memorized it many years ago, and I can't remember where it comes from. So if anyone does know where that's from, I'll crowdsource that. But he does say it. I just can't remember where it is. The greatest evil always veils itself as the greatest good. Namely, that to do great evil, you need to present your evil as good. And Arendt is throughout her life as worried about people who claim to be doing good as people who claim to be doing evil. So in her book On Revolution, she says that absolute goodness is as evil as absolute evil. And she gives as her examples of that Billy Budd from Melville, who is the Christ figure, who when he encounters evil is unable to even respond except by becoming a wrongdoer as well. Also the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's The Grand Inquisitor. The Brothers Karamazov, in which again the Grand Inquisitor seeks to do good by removing freedom from the world. And of course, to some degree, depending on how you look at it, well, we'll leave that out for a sec, but the French Revolution and the attempt to solve the social question, which led to the terror. For Arendt, the will to do good has to be something that is in the most private and personal of our in our lives, and that the attempt to do good in public not only will ruin the goodness because it will seem to be interested or otherwise, but it will generally become a kind of pity, which sees people as pitiful and allows us to take power over them instead of actually respecting them as human beings. And so here in this chapter, she develops her critique of goodness, at least in part, as that which must remain hidden and is dangerous if it enters into the public world. All right, I'll stop here and say that this is these are complicated and quite controversial, and at times people are gonna disagree with her, which is great. Just trying to just trying to what I can to make it clear, and look forward to the conversation. So there's two ways to discuss. You can talk with each other in the chat. People, if there are things in the chat that I should know about, maybe someone can let me know. But otherwise, raise your hand, and I see there's already a bunch of hands up, and I will start that going. Robert McKay, you got to unmute.
Yeah, let me find the passage. This is something she says which I simply can't follow. It's on page 71. She's talking about wealth threatening to reduce life to apathy and disappearance of initiative.
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay so far. But then she goes on, necessity and life, this is the first paragraph on 71, are so intimately related and connected that life itself is threatened where necessity is altogether eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
I take it she doesn't mean people are going to die. She just means it won't be real life. It'll be apathetic,
Right.
Or something.
So life, well, actually, let me say she means real life. What she says is if we have so much wealth that we have no desire to do anything, we will, in a sense, die of inactivity. Okay, I mean, maybe not die, but we will, in a sense, lose
Okay,
our life in the sense of our action, of our initiative to live.
sure.
You need a kind of necessity to act and to live, which is what it's an important point, and we'll come to it starting next week, because we're going to start reading the 3 chapters on the 3 aspects of the human condition: labor, work, and action. And again, I think one of the mistakes that people make in reading Hannah Arendt is they say, oh, labor's the lowest, it's the least important. And in some ways that can be defended, but Arendt is not really making that argument. I mean, labor is actually part of what it means to be human for her. And the loss of labor and the loss of the need for labor through wealth is actually dehumanizing.
Yeah, I think I've got that. What I was wondering especially about was what comes next. For the elimination of necessity, far from resulting automatically in the establishment of freedom, only blurs the distinguishing line between freedom and necessity.
Yeah.
I don't know, and it's the next 2 sentences that really throw me. Modern discussions of freedom, where freedom is never understood as an objective state of human existence, but either presents an unsolvable problem of subjectivity, of an entirely underdetermined or determined will, or develops out of necessity, all point to the fact that objective, tangible difference between being free and being forced by necessity is no longer perceived. I have no idea what that says.
Okay. So the first part is, in a way, this is I think a dig at Marx. So when she says that for the elimination of necessity, sort of the communist utopia, okay, right? Far from resulting in freedom, the idea that communism is freedom, as Marx says, only blurs the distinction or the distinguishing line between freedom and necessity. And then, in the parentheses, which is an attempt to understand that, if you think of freedom as simply free will, right, unsolvable, as my free will, or as my freedom as something that is an overcoming of necessity, we sort of blur the difference between freedom and unfreedom, and we lose what she's calling the objective, tangible difference between being free and unfree. What is that difference? Well, here's where we go back to the strong distinction between public and private. Freedom is to be free from necessity and being able to act in public. Necessity is to be so consumed with your needs that you can't ever be free from them and thus act in public. It's never absolute. I'm back to what I said at the very beginning, but that difference is for her something to always hold on to. And,
okay.
And so to the extent that we think of, we blur property into wealth, we lose that distinction because we lose the strongness of property as something which is private, and we lose the uniqueness of the public, something that is free.
So in the parentheses, what she's really doing is saying something like, the philosophers approach freedom and necessity much too abstractly, but they should pay attention to real life.
Exactly. Well, yeah. I think that's to real life in the sense of the tangible difference between freedom as being free from necessity and acting in a world with others, and necessity as being so consumed with one's bodily needs that one can't possibly think about going and acting in the public world. Okay. Layla.
Hi, Roger.
Hi,
Thank you. So I have a little bit of let's say a controversial understanding of why she cannot really separate between no, the way that she separates actually between privacy and intimacy. Especially in relation of privacy being away from others, while intimacy is experienced with existence of some people who we select. So intimacy is experienced with other people, supposedly, on a large extent, I would say as well, but also her romanticization of the idea of the house and the home, and the physical delineation of a safe place, while it's not always true that home is a safe place, not for everybody, or at least for a majority of people, I would say. I mean, the lucky ones who experience home as a safe, sacred place are the lucky ones. So for me, this is a little bit, I cannot really get why she doesn't separate clearly, or I mean, they're overlapping in a sense, but also this idea of expulsion from the public into the private, like slaves being in the private, women being in the private because they cannot access, or they are not qualified to be in the public. For me, this is also a little bit of I don't know how she's going through this, because being expelled doesn't mean that you don't have a place in the world. That doesn't mean that you don't have a presence, but it's more or less of appearance in the society that accepts you. So there's different forms of societies and different forms of, or let's say different spheres of public that not everybody accesses them. So I don't think also the bourgeoisie, for example, can access the realm of the public of the poor, of the slaves. So they're both somehow excluded in the same sense. So it would be very good if you can help me to at least delineate, because the way that she sets the physical space as a place of retreat is different from what it really is. So this is from me today. Thank you.
Layla, this is it's a good question, and it's one that I knew we were going to get to, and I'm glad you brought us there. Let's read a couple of these sections that she talks about and see if we can make sense of them, because I think this is a difficult and problematic part, which is, we'll see. Let's see. So on page 58 to 59, right? At the bottom of 58, she says, under modern circumstances, this deprivation of objective relationships to others and of a reality guaranteed through them has become the mass phenomena of loneliness, where it has assumed its most extreme and most anti-human form.
Yes.
So in that sense,
Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying.
Oh, Jerry, can you just mute yourself?
Medical Financial, how's it going?
Let me see if I can mute.
My colleague Jay Bachi, Jason.
That in this idea of being alone, she says we lose a place in the world and a house and home and hearth. Okay, then a little bit further down, she talks about how for the Greeks, they never really had this strong sense of family and home, but the Romans did. And she says, and although the conditions of slaves probably were hardly better in Rome than in Athens, it is quite characteristic that a Roman writer should have believed that to slaves, the household of the master was what the res publica was to citizens. And then she footnotes Plinius Jr. So what is she saying here? She says that, a Roman, right, thought that the house was, in Layla's terms, like a safe, good place even for slaves. And she's obviously skeptical of that here. But on on page 62, she'll bring this up again, where she'll say, the wealth of a foreigner or a slave was under no circumstances a substitute for this property. So they're saying that a foreigner or a slave who had one of the things that was unique is slaves could own wealth, but not property. They could have wealth, but they didn't have this property, this place in the world. And she says, and poverty did not deprive the head of a family of this location in the world and the citizenship resulting from it. So on the other hand, if you had a property, even if you were poor, you had a place in the world, which is something she comes back to on Revolution. Again, she thinks that if you're poor, but you have a property, you have a kind of humanity and dignity, which you might not have even if you're wealthy, but don't have that place or have wealth. And she continues, in early times, if he happened to lose his location, he almost automatically lost his citizenship and the protection of the law as well. I'm sorry. Actually, with the circumstances of a substitute for this property, on footnote 59, she says the distinction is most obvious in the case of slaves who, though without property in the ancient understanding, that is, without a place of their own, were by no means propertyless in the modern sense. The peculium, the private possession of a slave, could amount to considerable sums and even contain slaves of his own. So slaves could own slaves in Rome and Greece. Barrow speaks of the property which the humblest of his class possessed. So her argument here is that, I mean, again, she's trying to make the argument that to be without a home, you can be rich, you can have a lot of wealth. But if you're someone like a slave or a foreigner who's not allowed to own a home, no matter how wealthy you are, you're deprived of a certain humanity and a certain dignity of being human. So, I guess what I think this says is she understands, I think, Layla, the complexities of what you're asking. And yet, and this is something she does a lot, and this is, something that many people, criticize her for, even though she understands the complexity of these, and even understand that she understands that there's problems, she says that there's something meaningful about the public-private distinction that she wants to hold on to. She thinks that the public-private worlds, that the fact that there's things that belong in public and things that belong in private matter. She thinks that without them, there's a dehumanization of all men, all people, where we lose the capacity for freedom in the sense of people acting as plural, unique individuals in a common world. I think this is, for someone reading Arendt, this is one of those fulcrum points. Do you go with her and say, I understand the problems, but I think she's right? Or do you say, now, wait a second, we can't keep going and simply say, well, there's problems of people being dehumanized, and we're just going to keep going. This is not a question of her writing 50 years ago, I think, or now. This is deep in her thought. This is a fulcrum point. And she is basically saying, public and private matter. They've been screwed up. There've been exclusions. There've been all this stuff. But the idea of public and private matter and the loss of the matter and is dangerous. I don't know if that helps, Layla, but
To a certain extent, I would say yes. But I mean, for example, I just want to push this a little bit further. So
please.
for example, yeah, my research is about refugee camps, and the first thing you see after refugees, though that they receive a tent, for example, they somehow try to erect walls or put provisional divisions of what is theirs and what is public, or what is not. I don't want to say public, but non-private.
Right.
So the delineation between private and non-private is essential need. It's not, it's a place that you need to withdraw to.
Yeah.
So this is something I completely understand. And especially for migrants and refugees, I would say forcibly displaced people or disposition, their need to feel not as floating as they are.
Yeah.
At least not in time and space. So for me, but like not delineating between still the intimacy and privacy experienced in the oneness of the thing. So the one family, the one person, the one idea, the one thought, and intimacy experienced with the ones that you are close to. So for me, this is a bit, I don't know if it's not there because she doesn't want to go there, or if she mentioned that somewhere else. This would for me be very important.
Well, so
to understand at least.
Yeah, I mean, intimacy is something a little different for her. I mean, intimacy is a world that emerges once we start to lose, as you call it, the sort of the objectiveness of privacy, and as we do so, we turn inward into ourselves, and we create a private life inside of ourselves. And that's what she means largely by intimacy. It's the life of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as she talks about it. So we talked about this, I think, last week on page 39. It's the rise of the novel, which is an art form that looks at, you know, the rise of a character and their inner battle against the conventions of society. So the intimate is not sort of like me and my family per se. It's more a rebellion of the heart against the sort of moods of society. If that helps, I don't know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, so try it one more time, Layla. So I apologize if I am.
No, but maybe because it's very complicated, I would say an issue, because intimacy is also associated with positiveness, right? The word itself somehow provokes the feeling of good, of warmth, of something positive, while privacy doesn't always mean the same, at least in what she writes. So there's a little bit of a contradiction, I would say. I'm not sure if it's contradiction or just like the spheres of intimacy and the spheres of privacy may intersect, but somehow they're not the same, not even not physically, spatially, I mean, and also not in relation with society or with community or what it means to be in the common, not in the public. But both of them, they do not present themselves in the public. So they're both places for withdrawal, but the positiveness and the negativeness of the both is, for me, is kind of perplexing, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, intimacy has a positive sense of it's the flourishing of my inner life. But intimacy, insofar as it even in its positive sense, is a flourishing of my inner life, right? My love of poetry, or my love of, just my enjoyment of my own thoughts. It's also, it never has a kind of a commonness to it. It's the least kind of commonness. And it's the replacement of privacy in a world in which we've lost privacy. But it further withdraws me from the common world. Privacy, while it's a withdrawal from the common world, at least for Arendt, prepares me to go back into the public world. And And insofar as privacy is connected to private property, it also gives me a sanctuary in which I can be protected both from society and from the state, which intimacy does not. And so that's, I mean, yes, there's a positive nature to intimacy, right? It's the whole flowering of arts or of modern arts, which are so intimate, but not the public arts like architecture or performance. She would think of those not as intimate, but as more public.
May I jump in, Robert, Mara, to this point?
Quickly, yeah. Well, keep it short.
They keep it short, but because thank you, yeah, because the point that I wanted to make is that Arendt is very keen on conceptual distinctions, and at the same time of distinctions that lead to an oscillation between two. And she does that with the private and the public political, and she does that also in the two-in-one dialogue. And that two-in-one to become one from the public, from the private, I'm sorry, to the public, to then come back from the public to have an anchor in the private. And I think that maybe intimacy and privacy are also related to this duality that is necessary, right? Because Arendt is a thinker of the in-between. While she knows that you need to make distinctions because those are intuitively two separate realms, she also knows that the reality is much more complex and you cannot pinpoint them. So you need to be suspended in between. I mean, she wouldn't write the book Beyond Good and Evil. She would write the book Between Good and Evil, in the same way that she wrote the book Between Past and Future, right? She provides the framing, right, in order to think about complexities. That's all. And the gravitas is always the world, because even if you go back to the private realm, you do that to have the dialogue two-in-one in a way, in order to come back as one with individuality towards the world. That's the comment.
Thank you, Mara. I appreciate it. Clara, you're next. Clara, you still here?
Of course, I'm always here at this time and day. Wait for me, Professor Roger and colleagues. Okay. One, I would like to say that I celebrate the coexistence that Arendt, the coexistence, the relationship, the interdependence between a private realm and public realm. I mean, she says that more or less they are equally relevant. That is my conclusion. And I really find that really good in this discussion. I wrote down here, private realm and public realm for Arendt are equally relevant and meaningful. Good point? Yes, good point. Okay. Second point, I also want to make an emphasis and celebrate the differentiation that Hannah Arendt makes in terms of a shared common world and a public common world. And third, Professor Roger, if we can go to page 63, the first sentence, and you can read it because, I mean, I'm not a native speaker, obviously.
The first sentence, it is hidden?
Yes, can you read it? And then I would like to know your reaction, because for me, it was like a great surprise, isn't that? I have been doing a lot of readings about Hannah Arendt. This sentence, perhaps I don't know, I skipped it in the past, but it was so wonderful to discover this time. Go ahead, Professor Roger.
I'll just read the sentence before it as well. The non-privative trait of the household realm So the positive trait of the household realm, the non-privative, originally lay in its being the realm of birth and death, which must be hidden from the public realm because it harbors the things hidden from human eyes and impenetrable to human knowledge. It is hidden because man does not know where he comes from, when he is born, where he goes when he dies.
I mean, that's great. That was my reaction. It's great. What about you, Professor Roger?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of her defense of privacy. That there is that part of the private realm is that there are things that need to be hidden, and one of those things is birth and death, or two of those things, right? And that they need to be hidden because they're impenetrable, because they, okay, what does that mean that they're impenetrable? She says in the footnotes about the Eleusinian mysteries that the mysteries concerned the unspeakable, and experiences beyond speech were non-political and perhaps anti-political by definition. They concern the secret of birth and death seems proved by a fragment of Pindar. There are things about us which are hidden, must be hidden, can't be unriddled or solved, and as a result, they have to. They're so intimate. I'm sorry. I used the word, and I don't mean to use that word. They're so private that they need to be deeply held and personal to us, and we can't bring them into the world of light. They're part of the darkness from which we come from, and it's essential to who we are that we all come out of mystery. That's something she deeply believes in. She has a line in her essay on education about the danger of children of famous people because they live too much in the public realm, and they don't have an opportunity to live in darkness and in mystery. And as a result, she says they never grow up. They become they usually are problematic. We can, obviously there's going to be exceptions. I'm not trying to say anything, but she has a viewpoint that you need, especially as children, you need to be able to grow up in a world hidden. And yeah, I mean, I think it's part of her defense of privacy, and it's I think fairly profound. But there are all sorts of critiques we can make of it. One of which Layla already made, right? Which is that this house where we protect our privacy is safer for some people than others. And wealthier people are going to have more privacy than poorer people. There's all sorts of critiques that we can bring to bear on it, but I think the insight is one that's profound.
Yes, because I agree with Layla totally, 100%. And I also agree with you, and that was what I was looking for in terms of the profound of the reason she states for how you say, supporting the hidden in terms of mystery. That was new for me in terms of Hannah Arendt, and that's all. Thank you, Professor Roger.
Thank you, Clara. Good. Susan, right, you're up.
Hi, Roger.
Hi,
Hey,
Susan.
so I want to just change for a little bit and go back to her relatively short comments about goodness.
Yeah.
I found it amazing. There were things that she said in that section which didn't gel for me with other things that I thought that I've read in other places by her. I mean, one of the big things is she's such a proponent of acting in public, and yet somehow, unless I'm misreading it, that excludes goodness. And that's the first thing that really kind of astounded me in some way. She's excluding goodness from this plurality. She's excluding goodness from, you know, making an appearance almost, or manifesting itself. And as soon as and if goodness is manifested, it immediately loses any meaning or any goodness that maybe it might have had. So that was one comment. And then the other comment about her goodness that again doesn't gel. In other readings about her, et cetera, she seems to be quite a Christian. I mean, she seems to be a big proponent of Jesus Christ and his teachings. So I thought, well, that's interesting, because again, how does this idea of keeping goodness hidden somehow, you know, gel with those other beliefs or these other comments that she's made? Now, if she's talking about it strictly from perhaps an organized religion perspective and the politics that go on there, I can kind of buy that, but I'm not so sure that's where she's really going with it. And I don't know if she develops this idea anywhere else, but to me it was there was some very you know, some very pointed statements, very strong statements about that, that I wish she had maybe developed more. So your comments and thoughts.
Thanks, Susan. So yeah, on the first one, I mean, let me say that, as you rightly said, Arendt is I mean, I don't know how to say this without seeming trite, a huge proponent of good acts. You know, I mean, there in Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? She'll some of the, to me, the most alive pages in Eichmann in Jerusalem are in the chapter on evidence and witnesses near the end, where she talks about the hush that came over the courtroom when acts of certain people who had resisted, you know, were talked about. And, you know, she says at one point, the one lesson we learned is that if more people had done this, what could have, you know, would have been different. She herself during the war first did research for the Zionists and then worked with Youth Aliyah, bringing people around. So it's not that she's against doing good deeds, right? I mean, I don't think anyone would interpret that at all. What she says is that if you want them to be good, you have to do them in private. You can't, you know, seek recognition for it either from yourself or others. And on page 77, you know, talking about Machiavelli, who is her guide on this, she says that goodness is impossible in the public realm and is even destructive of it. And Machiavelli knew this. And he says that doesn't mean, though, that men must be taught how to be bad, right? It means Machiavelli's criterion for political action was glory. Later in this book, she'll rename glory greatness. What she says is that to act in the public, you have to aim to be great or to be glorious. You have to do things that will gain, that will shine, and you do so not out of goodness, but out of a desire to be seen and be recognized. And that to her and to Machiavelli is what it means to not be bad. You know, she's very critical of those who want to be good for a whole host of reasons, which I think I sort of went through already. But she also just doesn't think that we can ever know what good is. You know, so on your second question about Christianity and Jesus, I mean, there's a number of places in her texts where she talks about Jesus. One is at the end of this book, or the end of the action chapter in this book, where she's talking about transgressions and forgiveness. But I think the one that's most relevant for your question would be in her book on revolution, where, again, in this section where she talks about Billy Budd and the Grand Inquisitor, I don't know if you've read the Brothers Karamazov, Susan, but
No.
in the
Bill-
chapter,
Billy Budd, yes. Yeah,
but
sorry.
in the chapter on the Grand Inquisitor, the Grand Inquisitor wants to basically give everybody bread, and pan and cirque, give them bread and entertainment in order to buy off their protests and keep them oppressed. And Jesus sort of just looks at him with utter disdain, but says nothing. And she makes the distinction in that book between the Grand Inquisitor, who treats the people with pity and therefore elevates himself above them so that he should take care of them and decide how they should be treated, and Jesus, who treats each one of them as individuals or singular people in their own dignity, which she thinks is something that no human can do, right? But something that a potential God can do. But that's that would be her the closest she gets to a sort of embrace of Jesus.
Yeah.
In that sense, if that helps.
Yeah, it does a little. I mean, I think she takes it's kind of like the discussion we were having about the home, right? And the privacy and being a protected sanctuary. Sometimes I think she takes these concepts, and I think, Layla, you said it well, there's a romanticizing about things sometimes that, perhaps we find a little impractical or not true to experience. And it's kind of like this with goodness, it's like goodness is only goodness in the most pure sense, which has no ulterior motives. Yeah, no pity. Okay, I can kind of buy that. And yet it doesn't mean that they don't serve some benefit to people, even if there's an ulterior motive. Just
yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's romanticism. I mean, I think she's worried. I mean, what we can say is, well, we don't really want goodness. We want people who are aiming to make things better. And she would have no problem with that. It's not making things better that she has a problem with. It's the claim to do good, because goodness is not something we can know. And because goodness can never be satisfied, it leads to justifications for often horrific means in order to achieve it.
Yeah,
that's the danger with
I don't disagree with that. I just wanted to get to, and I think you kind of did, like a lot of times I'd like to try to understand when she says certain things about, say, and, goodness, is that she's in a different place with it. And I was just trying to get to that a little bit, because I don't think it's in the pedestrian sense, right? I think she's got something else going on there. So.
Okay, good.
That's good. Thanks for the
I'm sure it'll come back up. So if I got it wrong, and I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. I think it's right. Stephen, let's keep going, and I'm sure these questions will keep coming up.
Thanks, Roger. Susan stole nearly all of my thunder.
I told you they'd come up again.
Yeah. I got to thinking, especially as you were explaining chapter 77 or page 77, 78 earlier, that Arendt seems to be hung up on as I think you just reiterated now, claiming that we're doing good. So my simple-minded response to that is, well, why don't we just go ahead and do the action, whatever it is, calling it speaking truth to power, or doing justice, or trying to do the greatest social benefit for the greatest possible number. If it's the claim that's the issue, fine, we'll just forget about that. It would be good to be humble about this anyway, but we must continue to try to do the good without being overly self-identifying with it. And it seems to me if we cut goodness out of the public square, the public realm, we're divesting the public realm of a lot of ordinary moral action that people are doing every day. And I'm sure that Arendt doesn't want that, but I find this whole discussion a little bit eccentric.
Thanks. I'm open to that reading. I mean, that's sort of, I think what I was getting at the end of what I was saying to Susan, you can seek the better, not the good. I mean, certainly Arendt is not against acting to make the world better. She's against the claim to doing good. I think you've hit it right on the head. She's against the claim to virtue, and that politics is about doing things. It's not about, presenting oneself as virtuous or good. I think that's totally fair. And in fact, those who seek to do good will end up doing bad, right? That's her claim.
Roger, may I just add a small idea that I withdraw from the promise of politics in this relation with the good? I think what she worries about is not the idea of the good, but it's the idea of having this connotation between the good and the action. So what is the good action is? Instead of thinking what good is as a virtue and then it generates its own action, sticking the good to an action, then that has to be replicated and then being done with everybody else without thinking of it. I think this is more or less what I understood from it, but I don't know what you think of that.
Okay, so try it one more time, Layla.
Okay, so what I see is that her worry is not the idea of the good, but the good as a form of an action. So you have to give money to the poor, so that means that you're good, but not thinking of sharing as a value or as a thought that generates different forms of actions towards what good could be. Is it better a little bit?
I mean, again, she doesn't have a problem with donating to the poor. I think she, but this goes to what Stephen was saying, right? I mean, I think she doesn't have a problem with donating to the poor. I think she would have a problem of saying you have to, look, I'm donating to the poor. Look how good I am. A, and B, you have to donate to the poor in order to be good. I think she would find both those problematic. The good is a form of action. Yeah, I mean, I think she's all in favor of a form of action of doing things that, are right. She just doesn't want to call it good, in the sense that you have to do it. And you don't want to call it good because then you'd call attention to it and then it's not good. It's then, it's like Kantians. If you seek to obey, if you seek to show your duty by being dutiful, then you're not being dutiful. You're trying to show yourself to be dutiful. I mean, there's a bit of Kantianism in this. Maybe that's what some of you are rebelling against, I think, which I get. I mean, it's a bit of a linguistic argument, right? I mean, if you say you're being good, then you're not being good. You're doing it to show that you're good, which means you're self-interested. It's got that Kantianism to it. But I may not have understood what you said, Layla, and I apologize if I didn't.
No worries, it's already too complicated in my head as well. So I mean, this idea of linking virtue to a standardized action, let's put it this way. So the being good means 1, 2, 3. The actions are 1, 2, 3. Instead of thinking what good could mean and what good could generate. So the value itself is not thought, it is done. And then it is replicated. And then it becomes, for example, obeying the state is a good thing. So it becomes everybody's action is to obey to be good. So, but you don't think of the action itself as a value. This is for me what I think I also have encountered this in The Promise of Politics when we read it. And yeah, this idea, this I think what she wants, maybe she's going towards, but I'm not sure.
Okay. I'm happy to leave it as a comment. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Hal.
Totally. Yeah, no, sorry. I just need to, yeah, no, my question is about the, is about her discussion, because you mentioned, in terms of property ownership and her beliefs in that. Doesn't she situate art in terms of the political, in terms of what distinctions she makes between public art and I guess intimate art? How would that relate to such things as well? Because clearly she considers art as something as part of bringing about a common world. But I know in another essay she writes, I believe this one's called "The Crisis in Culture." She talks about how art is being transformed into culture, which is culture is being transformed into commodity, kind of similar to the other parts of the private realm. So how are these? Is it everything just becoming commodified? Is that what she's just coming to the conclusion of?
Well, she thinks that, yes, she thinks, unfortunately, a lot is becoming commodified. She thinks that art is becoming commodified insofar as increasingly art are things that are made intimately to express our subjective viewpoints, as opposed to, the quintessential example would be like a temple or something that sort of stands there and presents a worldly idea to be shared by everyone. Increasingly, art is something to be produced and consumed personally or intimately. She holds out alternatives to that, including performance, to the extent that it speaks to a public world engaged with spectators and artists. But she does worry that all art increasingly is becoming is losing its worldly character, as with not only art but all action. Art matters because to her, art is one of the most worldly and important activities that we can do, which is why the section on work, which is about the creation of things, the artificing of things that last and create our common world, ends with the chapter on the work of art, which we'll read, which is about the capacity of art to build a world and help create a world. And she talked a little bit about art in the pages we've already read about, the move from architecture that sort of sought to build things that articulated a cultural or a worldly idea to more subjective architecture, and obviously even more so than that to poetry and the novel, which bring art into the personal as opposed to the worldly. If that helps. I don't.
Roger, could I say something?
Yeah, hi, Vivian.
Hi.
The artists are going to speak out now.
Yeah, but I'm not speaking specifically about art, but I am going to mention one of Hannah Arendt's Landsleute, which would have been the amazing German Jewish art historian called Edgar Wind. Are you familiar with Edgar Wind? Well, you've heard of Panoply and all these important who were mainly German Jewish art historians who kind of set the canon that's not subsequently obviously been rewritten. But in any case, that's not my comment. Edgar Wind, in his book called Pagan Mysteries of the Renaissance, You know, since I am not a student of philosophy and I have never studied it, everything I sort of picked up from other books. So even though Arendt doesn't call herself a philosopher, in my view, she actually is, but she doesn't call herself one. So therefore, one can argue that she is not. And Edgar Wind was an art historian, but he in his book about Renaissance art history, he's discussing the humanist, the philosophy in the humanistic tradition, which is the tradition that Arendt later emerges from herself. Now, several points. To just touch on that point that Susan made about, I think I actually remember Susan saying something about getting to her place of goodness and it's not a pedestrian meaning. Yes, I have a different way of saying it, but for certain, because Arendt, in my view, is a philosopher or whatever, she's a philosopher because she comes from that tradition and because she writes like a philosopher also in a way. And so therefore, again, I remember saying this last week, what you see is not necessarily what you get. With Arendt, there's actually a dual thing going on. So that sometimes, I think she's always brilliant and she's always profound. But when she sounds hokey or prescriptive or dated, for, you know, or whatever word you want to use, then I think that it's useful to remember that nothing should be taken too literally, and that from her hokey or dated sounding statement about, you know, good or whatever, to abstract from that so that so we don't get too literal. And then to return to Susan's point, I think it was Susan's point about Jesus Christ and Christianity. Arendt quotes more than just quotes from. In her writing, she comes through at every moment through the tradition of philosophy. So even though you, Roger, have said many times she is the writer or the thinker or the philosopher or the whatever, the thinker of the new, she's always coming from the tradition which she lays bare, which is why it's difficult and esoteric to read if one is not well versed in that tradition. And she talks about the ancients. Now, to come back to the Christian thing, I don't think she's talking about Christianity or Jesus Christ. She's talking about something that's much older than that by thousands of years. It's interesting to me, and please correct me, but I've never known her to quote her contemporary theorists. I'm thinking mainly of Theodor Adorno here, but she's always quoting Aristotle or maybe Hegel, and then the last one, it would be Marx. I mean, time on the timeline. And so why I brought Edgar Wind into it is because I only know whatever I know about pagan mysteries of the Renaissance from Edgar Wind, not from reading Vico and the other Renaissance philosophers. But essentially anything in the ancient tradition, and this is going back to the idea of sanctuary, which other people have mentioned more than once, and the private and the public, anything worth protecting is worth hiding. There's a long, many thousands of years old tradition of this in every single culture, of this fact, whether it relates to an aesthetic holy object or an idea or an inner sanctum of the temple where, you know, only the initiated can go, and it's very indirect process to get to be the initiated. Just think of an onion and all the layers. And so I find it really fascinating, you know, so I just want to finish all these points that I want to try to remember to say, and then you can sort of correct me and forgive me that they're in a somewhat jumbled order. Adorno, for example, when you're thinking about the good, and several of you, including Roger, have paraphrased this also, Adorno says, by dint of moral zeal, the well-meaning become destroyers. All of this is essentially the same idea of doing good. There is, you know, Judaism is not the most ancient, but there is the tradition, the older than Christianity, condition of doing good or putting a X percentage of what you earn to give to the poor, all of these things. And none of it requires that you do this publicly. It's all something that you do because that is what you do when you live a moral or a correct life or whatever. And and by the way, I think that other lady, I don't know what her name is, that said, you know, she's always between this and between that. I think you said that it's between good and evil. It's not. It's beyond good and evil. It was between past and future, but it was beyond, by the way, good and evil.
I think she said that, but okay.
I misunderstood then. But anyway, that's my point. My point is that when she's sounding dated or eccentric, as someone else mentioned, I think that's true. Just to abstract from her, so abstract from the time in which she has written these words, and stand back and see from whence it comes, from a woman herself who, to go back to Layla's points, from a woman who didn't have that safe haven, that home. She didn't, even as a small child, because of her particular unsettling family situation, and neither did she as a citizen in Germany, which she was forced to flee. So okay, so I'm done, but I just want to know, Roger, if that is true, that it's very strange to me that she doesn't mention ever someone like Adorno, but is that because she never mentions her contemporary theorists? And by the way, I can't even read anything about the private sphere, the public sphere, without thinking about Adorno, particularly in Minima Moralia, when he writes about the commodification of intimacy and the commodification of privacy. So, okay.
No, thank you. I mean, there's a lot in there, Vivian, and I mean, I think the line at, you know, anything worth protecting needs to be hidden is right, and it goes to what Clara and others were talking about, and I think it's right on. I mean, Arendt and Adorno simply hated each other. I mean, it was very personal, and it largely revolved around Walter Benjamin, and also Gunther Anders, her first husband, who I think I have this right. I think Adorno prevented Anders from graduating with honors or something like that, and he also very much wanted to control Walter Benjamin's writing in a way that Arendt thought was wrong. So they really didn't get along. That's largely the reason for the silence. She cites a lot of contemporary people. I mean, certainly Jaspers, certainly Heidegger, her two teachers. I mean, even in this book, she's already cited Riesman on loneliness. You know, it's not that she doesn't cite contemporaries. You're right, she does. She is rooted in a tradition. But and she, you know, I mean, there aren't that many great contemporary, you know, the way it works is there's usually a couple of great thinkers of a generation. So she hasn't read them all. But yeah, she comes out of a particular tradition. There's no doubt about that. And yeah. Let me go on. Alex.
Roger, hey, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I have sort of a practical question that came up while I was reading this, and something that you raised at the beginning about why privacy matters. And Arendt spends a lot of energy making distinctions between different things, but I'm curious about sort of the interrelation of one of them in particular, the interrelation she might make between private life and public good. And in a specific sense, this came up in our district just this week, where there was a book that was removed from the 8th grade curriculum. And the kids, the 8th graders, wrote a letter to the school asking for an explanation why it was removed. And part of the explanation, which a lot of people had trouble with, which was, well, we actually looked into this author, and not an obscure author to most people, and we found that they had sort of a troubling private life, and that was a reason to remove the book. And what I sort of, so many people that feels wrong to, but in order to make the case of why someone's private life not only shouldn't have to do with their public good, but why they must have a private life. So I was just sort of thinking about, what would I say to the 8th graders, or what would Hannah Arendt say to these 8th graders about that important bond between private life and public good?
Yeah, it's a hard question, a good question. I mean, if you look at her essay on Bertolt Brecht, would be a good place to start, because what she says is that you can be wrong and a great poet, but you can't lie to yourself and be a great poet. And she sort of looks at the Brecht essays, the Brecht poems that were written, when he was simply fighting, which she thinks are great, and those that are written when he's trying to praise a bankrupt East Germany and Stalinist system, and she says then the poems betray him and can no longer be great. But there are certainly you don't have to look very far in her work. Look at Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger was a brilliant philosopher, and joined the Nazi Party and never left it. It's complicated about what kind of Nazi he was, and we can get into these kind of things, but from Arendt's point of view, his philosophy was without a doubt worth reading. She also cites Carl Schmitt's work in The Origins of Totalitarianism, another Nazi. I think if you would look at the way she treats Brecht and the way she treats Heidegger, you'll see a somewhat consistency, right? Which is that if the work is good, she's not going to not read it because of the person. But she thinks that when the person crosses a line, the work will no longer be good. She definitely stands on the side of, read the work, and the work will betray, whether the person was beyond hope or not. There are plenty of people with bad.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt. That is so not true, because art and aesthetics have disturbingly bugger all to do with morality. It's a separate issue. So really there isn't a causality there. Anyway,
well,
sorry.
But that's, Vivian, I think that's actually what I said, but maybe not. I mean, what she says is that as long as you're doing art, there's no connection to morality. What she says with Brecht is that at some point he stops doing art and he starts doing propaganda.
Yeah, no, that's different.
Do you think she thinks he's being dishonest to himself, though, that he doesn't actually believe this communist stuff? Because from what I've read, he actually seems to believe at least most of it.
Well, she raises that question in the text. She thinks he's basically, sold, at that point become a propagandist, which, whether you believe it or not is a harder question. But I mean, what she says is that when he's an artist, the morality doesn't matter, as exactly as Vivian said. As to the question about your 8th graders' books, I mean, I think there's a different issue, right? Which is, I think there's a bunch of issues, should they be reading great books, and also you're looking at role models and mentors and stuff like that. But Arendt is a big believer in the right of people to be immoral. I mean, let's just, in private. She has a very strong sense that great artists and great thinkers and great politicians, and even not great ones, but she thinks that what people do in private is not really our concern. And that's not a moral position on her point. It's actually comes from what we read today. She thinks that in order to be a deep person, sometimes you have to have darkness from whence you come, and that the human heart, as she says on Revolution, is a dark and mysterious and not very pretty organ, and we often want terrible things. And if someone knew what we always wanted, if we would all look pretty awful, which is why hypocrisy for her is an absolutely essential political need. And we should not go hunting for hypocrites, because we're all hypocrites. None of us could survive a second in the public world, certainly not today, if everything we thought was made public. She has a very strong sense that we need to separate our inner thoughts and what we say at home and say to our friends from our work. Now, it gets more complicated when someone's work becomes politicized. This raises the question Vivian just raised about the relation between art, morality, and politics. And can you do political art that is art? I think Arendt thinks the answer is no. We can discuss that more at another time.
Arendt was a judge than many other people of that personally, but yes, I think it's possible for what it's worth. It's possible.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, some art can be political, but she thinks that if it's made as political art, she thinks it's unlikely to end up being great art.
That's true for great art too. If you make something as great art, it's very unlikely that it will be. So yeah. No difference.
But what's the difference between public art and political art? Because it seems like you said public art would have to aspire to something kind of great and something that would kind of inspire the whole community. And you think of loads of works of art. I mean, people mention Antigone in the chat. I mentioned Antigone myself before, but obviously she would consider that art. And at the same time, that's obviously has a political message.
Yeah, I think maybe a better idea would be like the Parthenon or a temple, or whatever, which you could argue is political. I don't think she would see it as political. I think she would say it's made in glorious day, in the glory of God, out of an idea, but not, and it's made to glorify, not to tear down or make fun of. I think would be one way to put it.
Just to interject a minute, she certainly is not aware or blind to conceptual art, which is built on the message rather than the execution, built around the idea that the art is conveying, such as started in Dada and then Surrealism.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll talk more about art when we read the section on art later at the end of the chapter on work, and we'll have a lot more to say about it then. So stay tuned. Alex Shumarov.
Hi, Roger. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I want to go back to this question about goodness. I think this has been raised already. I think Susan raised something to this effect and others. But I want to bring up an example. So I was thinking, as I was reading the chapter, about a bit about our Canadian experience here. I'm in Toronto, and one of our sort of honorable, big honorable deeds of the 20th century was the public healthcare system, and I think that's true not just of Canada, but many European countries really pride themselves on. I know it's definitely true in the UK. And and what's interesting is that that kind of act, which is it's a public act, it's a political act. At the same time, it's oriented towards health, right? Something very kind of embodied, and that would seem to be private in a sense. And in Canada too, the guy who started it, his name is Tommy Douglas. He was actually a Baptist minister who went into politics. And I guess the reason I bring this up is it seems to me that's an example of an act where some of these distinctions that Arendt is holding to actually get bridged and get kind of, they merge with one another, it seems to me. And so, so like the basic distinction between the public and the private. And that led me to think that actually I have this sense that Arendt, there's a kind of dualism that she holds on to and kind of embraces. And even though, she's very critical of Plato, she's critical of this philosophical tradition, I wonder if there isn't something of that tradition that she actually kind of inherits, and especially this like sharp distinction between the spheres. I wonder if there isn't something actually about modern politics that's about going beyond those distinctions, that's about bridging these divides and kind of preserving both sides in a kind of unity or synthesis or whatever you want to call it. And I'm curious what an Arendtian response might be to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think she would take what you said and say you're 100% right about what's going on. The rise of the social is a kind of bridging of the public and the private. It's a blurring of them. It's it's taking away the hard edges. It's saying that things like healthcare is something where we want to publicly, address private issues. And she would say, look, there's good reasons to do it. It's happening. We're not going to deny it's happening. But we should think what we're doing. And we should be aware that in doing it, we are losing something like the public sphere and something like the private sphere. And there are costs to that. On the first level, that's the way I read her. The costs, are, well, on the private sphere, more and more of your private lives and your body are now publicly knowledgeable and accessible. And, you have to fill out forms and go to checkups, and you are now part of a public database. And, your private life is not so private. And, your decisions about what to eat or not to eat or how to exercise, become part of public knowledge and the public good. And so, you lose a certain privacy. And on the public sphere, insofar as we try and bring everybody to a common single idea of health, we lose uniqueness and we lose distinction and we lose the ability to act and say things that are really shocking and new and potentially awful, but also potentially great, because there's a fear of and an inability to upset or the apple cart, as we say. So no doubt what you're saying is right. We're living through an age of the blurring and the challenging of these strong distinctions. She's not per se for or against it, right? This is what people got mad at me last week about. What she says is it's happening. it's going to change the conditions in which we live and thus change the human condition. And we should think about it. And there's things we're going to lose and we should be aware of it. And if we're going to do it, we should do it thoughtfully rather than thoughtlessly. I mean, that to me is the overarching approach that she brings. Okay, Dina.
I wanted to, well, we don't have much time left, but I just wanted to make two suggestions. And one was on the quote from page 63 about the hidden, what we keep hidden in the private might actually also refer back to what she discusses on pages 10 and 11, which is that we cannot answer what we are or who we are. And her discussion of Augustine, and I think also maybe influenced by Heidegger and his definition of Dasein. So these impenetrable, we are impenetrable to ourselves to a certain extent, because we cannot answer what we are. And I just also wanted to sort of respond to the idea that Arendt was dated or eccentric or romantic or hokey or whatever other adjectives have been used. I think her discussion of doing good based on pity and based on this idea that it gives us a social value, making yourself feel good by doing good, is actually a criticism of certain liberal attitudes, which she also discusses on page 59 in the context of slavery. And the idea that, you know, she makes very clear that, you know, slavery is not improved in any shape or form simply by providing more access to wealth. And I think that sort of is the idea also of her criticism of the idea of good, of doing good in a public way. It's also a criticism of a certain liberal attitude.
It's also a criticism. No, it's also, I think you're right, Dean. It's also a criticism of this attitude of, if we create more wealth in society, we'll be happier.
Or we'll be more equal.
And we'll be more equal. And from her point of view, even if we're more equal and we're wealthier, we may be less free.
Right.
And,
so rather than accuse her of romanticism, you might want to check your own romanticism.
All right. We're not gonna go checking privileges and romanticisms.
No, but I mean, like, just calling her dated and hokey and romantic deserves a response.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're all here because we find her relevant, or we wouldn't be sitting here reading her every day, every week. And I agree with you. You know, which is not to say that she doesn't sometimes say things that, you know, need to be reconsidered.
Absolutely. Let's do that.
But so we should, you know, and she does at times reconsider things she says. You know, she's not the most, you know, she's not a systematic thinker in the sense that she, you know, has words that have precise meaning. She speaks, she writes for popular journals. She's writing in the vernacular. And sometimes she says things that, and she's also writing in her third language. You know, so, you know, she says things that sometimes need to be thought. On the question of the privacy issue and the who am I or what am I issue, they're similar in that they're both about limits to what we can and can't know. And, you know, on page 10 or 11, she's talking about, you know, how there is no such thing as a human nature. There's only a human condition because we can't know who am I.
Right. So that's the aspect of what's impenetrable to human knowledge on page 63, because we cannot know where we come from and where we're going.
And I think that goes
in Augustine, only a God could tell us.
Right. I mean, on 63, she's talking about birth and death. She's not, whereas not per se human nature. But I think you're right. These are all part of the mysteries that she accepts and believes need to be protected and held on to. So absolutely. Good. We're running out of time, but I see two more questions. Let's try and, or three, but I'll try and get them in Vigdis?
Yes, I will take one. I had two, but I'll take one of them then. And that's about privacy. And I see in Arendt, I find there also a connection between privacy and thinking, because to think we need to be alone. And this will have something to do with the public and how we appear in the public. And then I wonder, when she sees the social sphere coming up, that in a way swallows up both the private and the public. Is this also in some way that in the social, there is a lot of appealing to our emotions and not to the rational part, and in a way that this social sphere in a way swallow up our ability to think about things, and then come out in the public with our opinions, so in a way our doxa. And that this also goes for the intimacy, that why she then has this distinction between the social and the intimacy, that they both are more into the emotions.
Well, I mean, the social is not necessarily the emotional. I don't think that works. I mean, the social is what the social does, what the social is based in above all is, as she says, what we called on the chapter 9 on page 68, what we called earlier the rise of the social coincided historically with the transformation of private care for private property into a public concern. This is called administration or bureaucracy, which is the most rational form of government that there is. So the social, as she said in chapter 6, is really the rise of statistics and behavioral sciences and the social sciences, and the attempt to normalize or rationalize human behavior. And it devours, she'll say, back in chapter 6, the older realms of political and private, as well as the newer realm of intimacy. So the social is sort of a rational, behavioralistic, administrative realm that devours public, private, and intimate, as she'll write. It needs to be seen for what it is, as the attempt through a kind of normalization and socialization to level down and create acceptable, verified opinions that everyone would share. So, and thus it's supposed to attack privacy, where you have unique opinions, and it's supposed to attack publicity or the public, where you have glorified or great acts, which exceed sort of the sort of common vice, the common sense of the social, not the common sense, the commonality of the social. So yeah, the intimate is not the social. The intimate is the intimate is a reaction against the social, that once we, in a sense, diminish the public and the private, people seek to escape from the social into their internal intimate world. And the social even attacks that by telling them what they can think and what they can't think. Okay. Emily.
Hello, sorry, I was clicking on the wrong button. I'll try and be really quick. So, it's been mentioned loads and loads of times today that performance and architecture are in the public. And I'm just confused. I'm finding lots of things really contradictory, and I wondered if you could shed a bit of light for me or help me clarify. So, going I'm jumping about in the text as well, but on page 57, she says that the object of our attention should be fixed. So we look together at our fixed object, and that's what constitutes the world. And so I initially read that as the artwork would be the fixed object that we would be looking together at.
Where are you reading on page 57, just so I know?
Sorry, I'll give you the exact.
Just give me a sense.
So just before the start of the final paragraph, she says, only where things can be seen by many in a variety of aspects without changing their identity. That section there. Page 57 in the...
Right.
Yeah. So, and then I've jumped right forward to page 178 as well, which I know is cheating because we're not talking about that today, but she's talking about action and speech being only meaningful because they come from an actor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just really struggling to think about the fixity of performance and why performance is a public act in her view, when to me it seems that performance is bodily, that the bodily takes it into the private realm, and that that performance is also ephemeral.
Yeah.
So a performance or a speech act can exist in memory, but from my performance theory background, I'm thinking about some of the things that Peggy Phelan talks about, that performance by its nature.
The key importance of performance and also action is that it happens in public, and thus for spectators. It's the fact of spectators that matters for her. You know, if I write a poem, it may never be heard by anybody, right? Okay. But I perform something, I put it out there, and people can respond to it. And while there's an actor, they're actually responding not to the actor, but to the act and to the performance. I may disclose who I am, right? But in the end, that who is not up to me, it's up to the spectators who
living in memory. Is an action living in memory?
Well, memory is part of it, yeah.
Good enough.
Memory is a big part of it, but it's not just memory. It's that the spectators talk about it and make it part of the world, and it becomes part of the public world.
So it has to become part of a public memory. Would that be a fair?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm really struggling with.
Yeah, we'll talk a lot more about that in the work and action sections. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was trying to do that quickly.
Yeah. John, do you have a quick question? Because I got to run soon, but if you have a quick question, we can go through it.
I'll try and make it quick. I know the part where she speaks of goodness, what struck me, and private property, struck me as two aspects. One is the tzedakah, which in the Jewish tradition, Maimonides wrote about, and the 8 levels of it, and the highest level being where neither the donor nor the recipient know each other, and the act of goodness is in and of itself. And when she speaks of private property, sort of there's a sanctuary, a holy place. They're both references really from the Jewish Hebraic tradition, where actually in the sanctuary you have the Ark, the Torah, the Bible, which and it is a most private place. Given her background, she never really speaks about her Jewish tradition, and I wonder why.
You know, she does at times. She you know, first of all, let's say she doesn't know it as well. You know, she didn't grow up going to you know, getting an education in the Jewish tradition. Her parents were largely social democratic, secular Jews. There are a few Jewish thinkers she gets to know pretty well. The primary one being Gershom Scholem, and she reads his work on mysticism. You know, and in some of her work, Judaism will creep in those ways. But you know, if she's going to talk about tzedakah, she's going to talk about Immanuel Kant, because that's what she knows best. She doesn't know Maimonides. I doubt she's read Maimonides. And if she's going to talk about sanctuary, she's going to cite the Romans and Coulanges, because that's what she's read at this point in her life.
I see. I have one question. Thank you. I have one further question on private property. When I read that, and just from my own knowledge, which is limited, but I can't find in history where private property ever existed in essence. So when she speaks of it, is she speaking of it from a sense of the theoretical? Is there reality to her?
What do you mean? I mean, she's thinking of it in very common sense terms, people owning a house or a land. I mean, it's existed forever.
But historically, that's never been a sanctuary that's been inviolate. As a matter of fact, we have it identified in our Constitution originally that certain rights are inherent, and that's the first time you hear of it. Historically, the private property has never been that type of sanctuary. It's always been able to be violated. Now, I'm not questioning it in its essence.
John, it's always, everything is always able to be violated, but I mean, it was still sacred. I mean, at least for the Romans, and this is where she's building it on, the house and the hearth and the family gods were kept in the house, on the hearth, and they were seen as sacred. You know, I don't, you know, we could go through, obviously sacred things throughout history have been violated, right? I mean, it's the history of war. And, but that doesn't mean that they weren't sacred.
Well, I'm just trying for my own purposes. When I read, am I reading this from her point of view as an abstract, or is there a reality?
She's making a very real claim. If she's wrong, she'll be wrong, but she's not making it as an act. The person who makes this claim as an abstract claim is Hegel, right? Hegel says that private property is the realization of freedom, and that there can be no freedom without private property, and no private property without freedom. So if you read The Philosophy of Right, that's what that book starts. The first 100 pages of that book are about the connection between property and freedom. She's not Hegel, but she's trying to say something similar, but in a very non-abstract and concrete way.
Got it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So look, this section is a complicated and controversial section, and I'm glad we made it through it. We're moving on next week to the chapter 3 on labor, which you know, again, on the one hand is going to be well, it's a critique of Marx, and yet it's also inspired by Marx, and so I look forward to reading it with you. I apologize that we've been a little behind in getting the videos from 4 years ago online. We just had some staffing problems, but we're getting to it, and they should be ready for next week and go out with the emails soon. So I look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about labor, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you all very much.